Is our world beyond saving? Look around. Globally, nationally, locally, we have problems that we can't even count. And every time it seems like we fix one, 10 more pop up. When do we finally admit that this world has no hope? Let's talk about it today. Well, good morning. Hey, as we said, and I want to reemphasize what Scott kind of invited to us tonight, is tonight at 5 o'clock is our very last summer family experience. And if you've been going to that, it's been fun. Our kids are having a good time, then we get to send them away. And as parents, we get to do training, which has been frightening and fun all at the same time, right? You watch the videos and you're like, man, I'm a terrible parent. But then you leave encouraged that everyone else is a terrible parent too. So we're all in it together. But we'd love to have you there tonight at 5 o'clock as we're wrapping that up. But this morning, we're continuing through our study in the book of Genesis. And as I was kind of thinking about this and we're approaching it today, the first thing that all of a sudden, as I was kind of watching my week and the surroundings, is what is different this week and what is changing? And one thing that happened last week is we got some rain. Okay, can we say hallelujah, right? And the monsoon is tricking us a little bit. It's like teasing us, like it's coming. I actually showed up to church this morning and it was raining, and then like an hour later it stopped, and then it's just windy and terrible and humid. But we're hoping we're gonna get some rain. But here's what's fun about rain and monsoons during the summer of Arizona is it's fun to watch how people react. I've lived here my entire life. This is what I've known. So I understand that it can be 110 outside and still raining, right? I know how that works. Or when the weather drops and it's crazy, but people that don't know how monsoons are like, what in the world is happening? Like I thought I was in Phoenix in summer, literally feeling like hell. And then all of a sudden, like there's rain and there's wind and trees are toppled over, streets are flooded. We might get there this week, right? Nobody knows how to drive. They're all cowering in fear in their patios, just watching it rain. But it's fun because it almost like makes you question, like, where am I? Am I still in Phoenix? And you see, today when we look around our world, there are a lot of things when we observe it and we start to just dig into it, we might ask the question, is this the world we grew up in? Is this still the world that I recognize today? You see, on both a local and a national and a global level, our world faces a lot of issues. And it faces so many things that we like see and we're like, I don't know if this is gonna get better. Like, how did we get down this path? How are these things going forward? If you start on a global stage, some of the huge issues that we don't even really probably see, but that are behind the surface, and as I was doing some research this week, is one of the biggest issues right now our world faces, and we've probably heard about this before, is food insecurity, or the scarcity of food. Did you know that there are over 50 million children under the age of 5 who are malnourished and who are at a point that they might not have enough food to survive? 50 million throughout our worlds. You continue down that trend. One of the other biggest issues that we're seeing lately in this past year, and it's been always an issue in our world, but it's just getting even worse and worse, is forced immigration or refugees. That there are over 80 million refugees throughout our world that have been forcefully from their home, whether it's through war or famine and through any other means, and over half of those are 18 or under. As you continue and think about some of the stuff that came out from the pandemic and from COVID, some of the things that are unseen in that is there's been a huge rise in child marriage, meaning there are families around the world who, because they can't afford to put food on the table, are selling their young daughters in marriage in order for their family to survive. Estimates are there could be as many of 13 million additional child marriage that are coming in the coming years just because of this pandemic. And linked closely into that is child labor and trafficking has gone through the roof as people are having children beg in the streets and go to factories, especially in places like Asia, where it says estimated that there are more than 8 million children who are being forced into those areas because of needs of survival for families. You see, this doesn't just happen on a global level, but nationally we see issues as well. When it comes to political division, when it comes to violence, when it comes to all these issues that are facing our world, and even on our level, when you look around our city, you see people struggling with rising costs and homelessness and hunger is at an all-time high. And when we look at this, you see our world has a lot of problems. But the funny thing about this is it has very few solutions. Politicians will run and say, I'm gonna fix everything. Rich people and public figures and an athlete will come on TV and make a statement. We think it's gonna be great, but then we see offices change, we see money's thrown at things, but these problems still persist. And when one problem is fixed, about 5 more pop up. You see, this comes to our key thought today. That is, our world has a lot of problems, but it has very few solutions. It seems like every day you open up your phone and you scroll social media, and if you're on like Twitter, it's really depressing. If you're on Instagram, it's just a bunch of pictures. If you're on Facebook, it's a bunch of arguing. And if you're on TikTok, you're probably not in this room because you're too young, right? Did I just sum it all up really good? But we scroll social media, or you go read the news, or do they still have newspapers? I think they do, right? You open them up and you just scroll headline after headline of depressing things, of another reason to be angry, another reason to be pessimistic, another reason to be sad and just wish for God to throw a big fireball on the earth. And our world will say things are going to change, but it just doesn't seem to happen. But it's not just even bad on a big level, but sometimes in our personal life, it's the same way. We ask questions of like, how am I all of a sudden going to make enough money to keep going on this path? How am I going to put food on the table for my kids? Or how are my kids all of a sudden going to become nicer and listen to me? How am I going to raise this kid so they're not a jerk later in life? Not a personal struggle at all that I'm struggling with. But maybe you're asking other questions. How am I going to kick this addiction? How am I going to change this lifestyle? How am I getting healthy? How am I going to blah, blah, blah? And the list goes on and on and on. And we start to ask, are things really going to get better? Or should I just accept that it is beyond saving? Today, I want us to wrestle with that question. Is how do we know if our world is beyond saving? And you're like, man, this is super depressing. Don't worry, it's gonna get more depressing, okay? If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to Genesis chapter 6. And we're gonna wrestle with this, and we're gonna ask this question of how do we know that at the end of the day, our world is just not gonna get better and it is beyond saving and there's just something we can't do about it. Recently, I took my son, Archer, my middle child, to the doctor. And since my youngest son, 11 months ago almost, was born, our family can't stay healthy altogether for more than like 3 weeks. Like, we're going good, and then one kid gets sick and passes it to that kid, and passes it to that kid, passes it to mom, passes it to dad, and we just start the cycle over and over again. It's so fun, I love it so much. But I take him to the doctor because he's been coughing, he has boogers everywhere, he's disgusting, he's a child, right? That's how it works. And I go and they're looking at him and they're like, well, he doesn't have an ear infection, so it's something viral. So like, it could be COVID, it could be the flu, or it could be a common cold. I'm like, that really narrows it down, okay? And literally the doctor said this, I don't even think it's worth testing for it because it's one of those things, but you're gonna all have to treat it the same way. You're just gonna have to deal with the symptoms and hope the body heals itself and gets better. And you see, we kind of treat our world the same way. We look at poverty, we look at violence, we look at hunger, we look at fill in the blank of what's happening in our world, and we see the symptom of the problems that are in our world, and we're like, let me just treat that problem and hope everything behind the scenes heals itself. But hey, here's the first way we know that our world is in a place that it cannot recover from and that it is beyond saving is there is an incurable disease. Genesis chapter 6, and let's actually go a few verses into this, starting at verse 11. It says this, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. God saw how corrupt the earth was, for every creature had corrupted its way on the earth. Verse 13, then God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to every creature, for the earth is filled with wickedness because of them. Therefore, I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Oh, I told you it was going to get more depressing, right? God looks, and we jump into this story in Genesis chapter 6, and God looks at the earth and he said, this is bad. This is too bad to even recover from. I'm gonna wipe it all out and I'm gonna start over. I'm gonna just destroy all the creatures that he just created not that long ago, and he's gonna start over with a clean slate. He simply said, I'm gonna just destroy it. It was about 1,600 years ago that he finished making mankind, and God just says, let's start afresh. The crazy thing is God actually says this of our world today. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. On that day, the heavens will pass away with a loud noise. The elements will burn and be dissolved." That is talking about here, and it says, "And the earth and the works in it will be disclosed." You see, God is going to one day destroy the heavens and the earth that we know today. And we're going to read a little bit in Genesis chapter 6 how in this time God let this story play out. We're going to study that today and over the next few weeks. But I think we need to note here that even in our present world, in our present universe today, that our world is beyond saving, that there is an incurable disease that one day God's going to straight wipe it all out. So how did this disease come about? And I think we can learn a little bit from Noah's day of how did we get to this point? How did things get so bad that God just like, I'm just going to destroy it all? Well, the first thing that happened is there was some compromised families. Let's go back up to the very beginning of chapter 6 and verse 1. And this is how this chapter starts. It says, "When mankind began to multiply on the earth." And just kind of a quick note here. Like we said, this is about 1,600 years from when Adam and Eve first have their child to where we get to Noah and he having his kids here. And like we said this last week a little bit, they're like bunnies. They're having like kids left and right. Like they're populating the earth. They're filling that thing. Like, they started with 2 people and they're like, hey, we're going to like exponentially do this. And you do the math, like, right? If you put 2 bunnies in a room, you leave them for like a year, I think there will be lots of bunnies. It's crazy. So all of a sudden it began to multiply and it begins to fill the earth like crazy. And it continues and says, "And daughters were born to them." Verse 2, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves." Now this kind of takes some explaining because there's a few different interpretations of here. When it says the sons of God, we talked a couple weeks ago that God there's 2 lines that broke out from Adam and Eve. And one of those lines was the line of Seth, the line that would eventually lead to Jesus, the line that God was blessing, that God was working through. But the other line was the line of Cain. Cain, the guy who murdered his brother, that was this wicked man, and he set his family path on this wicked way. And what happened here is the sons of God is actually referring to the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of mankind are referring to the daughters of Cain. So what happened, instead of going on this path and kind of keeping their ways pure, they began to intermarry. And all of a sudden, that sin started to creep into Seth's line. And as they're making babies like bunnies and going crazy, this sin is spreading and spreading and spreading vastly throughout the world. Verse 3, "And the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. Some estimate this is the time when God starts saying this and the time that Noah will have to build the ark, which we're going to talk about in a second more. Verse 4, "Then the Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterwards. When the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind who bore them, they were powerful men of old, the famous men." This Nephilim term, some say this is the angels on the earth, but what this is really probably referring to is strong men of leadership, but who are corrupt and wicked in the world. Now, overall, here's what these verses are kind of saying. As we said a little bit of this last week when we looked at the legacy of Adam and Eve, that it was inconsistent, right? Cain was wicked, and Seth, the other one, was righteous. But Seth's descendants all of a sudden started mingling with Cain's descendants, and they started blending, and all of a sudden, this inconsistent legacy started just corrupting the world all around them. And you see, when Satan finally attacked and kind of got to this point where the world was so wicked that God said, I need a reset, it started with attacking the family. And you see, today we see the same thing. That when brokenness happens in our world, when sin happens in our world, when division, and you even look at societal scales, the first thing that usually happens is the breakdown of the family. Is that when families are broken, they're disintegrated, kids aren't raised in the right environment. Now, you might be asking, you hear that, you're like, okay, what if that's my situation? What if I'm part of a broken family? What if I'm trying to parent in a broken family? Do I just give up and say there's no hope? Absolutely not. But there are going to be consequences for that. But it's by the grace of God that we see restoration. It's by the grace of God that he still works through it. But here we see that the first sign that there's this incurable disease in the world is that there was these compromised families, but there was also compromised morals. Check out verse 5. It says, when the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. I just want to stop right there. Think about that for a second. He says every inclination, this verse should just it gives me fear, right? God saw humankind and he said that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. Recently, my wife and I started a new show. We run out of shows to watch after the kids go to bed, and it's like TV off season, and we've streamed what's good that we can both agree on. And so I'm making her watch Scrubs, an old show. It's an old sitcom that, one person likes it. That's great. They need to restore it to HD, so it's a little more watchable now, but that's a side note. But in it, it's a hilarious show, and it's genius if you really watch it and get connected. But one of the characters, Elliot, is in there, and we watched an episode recently where she doesn't want to open up to her boyfriend. She doesn't want to talk too much, and he knows she's holding back. He's like, Elliot, just tell me what's in your mind. And then she goes on this rant talking about all the crazy thoughts that are in her head, everything she's been thinking, and she's like, I didn't want to tell you that I'm a bucket of crazy, and she goes off on this huge thing. And the irony is, as I watched that, I turned to my wife, I was like, are you that crazy? No, I'm just kidding. But we are all that crazy to some degree. And there is evil thoughts inside all of our minds. And sometimes we like to say as we bury those thoughts down or we think it, and we're like, man, nobody else has these messed up thoughts in their head, do they? And the real question is, yes, they do, right? They just don't speak them out loud. Some of us speak them more than others should, than we should. And that's why we look crazy. But we all have evil thoughts and crazy thoughts and things that go through our head that we wish never crossed our minds. And it is part of this sin nature. And we saw that back in Noah's day, that this evil, these thoughts were in their head and that it never relented. It never stopped. Now here's where I think kind of a side note, we're gonna get more towards the application later, but I think a side note here for us is that this is why it is so important to be seeking God and seeking Jesus continually. When we're praying, when we're reading our Bible, when we have routines in place where we're seeking God, what we're doing is we're slowly rewiring our brain. That doesn't mean all of a sudden you don't have that terrible thought, right? No. I was actually watching a video today on social media that someone posted, and it was their kid boogie boarding on something, and they're like, their kid's doing so good. And my first thought was, I can't wait for the kid to fall off and eat it, right? That's a wicked thought, okay? We have those that will come into our mind, but the more we seek God, the more our brain will be rewired to seek his glory and not to seek our sin. But here we saw they had just got too far down that road. They had compromised their families, they had compromised their morals, and lastly, they had compromised their environment. Read in verse 6, it says that when God saw this, that the Lord regretted. Now it says regretted here. Really, this word is more of that he mourned, and it's gonna emphasize this again in a second, that he mourned that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals, the creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I mourn that I made them. You see here the compromised families and the morals even compromised the good creation, the environment, the earth's animals, to the point that it was beyond repair. Now, here we need to, I think, take a note again that our earth does has an expiration date. Now, we might do things in technology and do things that our world might try to have breakthroughs that we try to stem that tide and whatever that looks like in scientific terms. But there's an end time, and scientists will even tell you, probably how the universe progresses, that eventually our world has an end date. In here, God kind of tells us that one of the reasons for that is we were not good stewards of his creation. If you were with us through this series in Genesis chapter 1, we started when God created everything, that God put on mankind's responsibility to rule, to look after, to be the one taking care of the earth and the animals and everything in it. And we see in Noah's day, and we even see today, that we have not done a good job with that when it comes to loving our earth, loving animals, and even loving one another. So I know what you're thinking. because I was thinking the same thing as I was writing the sermon, is this is a really big bummer, right? This is like depressing. This is super depressing. Usually I try to put more hope in it early, but I was reading the story. I'm like, this is not a hopeful story. It's funny, whenever I think of the story of Noah, there's an old song that goes through my head called Arky Arky, right? And it was like, talks about Noah built the ark and it's a rainbow and it's all happy. Like he flooded the earth and everyone died, okay? It was not that happy of a story. You read it and you're like, whoa, this is heavy. But as you're going through this, you're like, man, where is the hope? Where is God like showing us like the glimmer that's out there? Well, one comes in verse 8. And here's our kind of next thing is when we know our world is beyond repair, that there is an incurable disease, but there's also a glimmer of hope. Check out verse 8 of chapter 6. It says, Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. Noah found favor with the Lord. Verse 9, it says, these are the family records of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God, and Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah gets this same little phrase in here that we read in chapter 5, is that he walked with God. And if you joined us last week in chapter 5, that word was used for a man named Enoch. And Enoch was actually one of 2 people, him and Elijah in the Bible, who never actually died on earth, that they were literally just taken up to heaven. It said he walked with God and then God just like snatched him up. They were playing hide and seek. Nobody ever found Enoch again. They're like, where'd he go? But he just grabbed him up. And this phrase was to signify this deep, intimate, spiritual relationship with God. It wasn't people looked at Noah and was like, Noah's a solid dude. Noah's a good guy. It's like, no, Noah is sold out. He has given his life to following God, to being faithful with God. It is all that he cares about. It is his total priority in how he follows him. But here's what is so amazing about all of this, that despite mankind and despite the world not deserving it, God gives hope. Micah 7 verse 18 says, who is a God like you? Forgiving iniquity and passing over rebellion for the remnant of his inheritance. He does not hold on to his anger forever because he delights in faithful love. You see, Noah made mistakes. He was human. He was imperfect. He was still sinful. He didn't deserve to be saved, but God still saved him anyway. They actually use this phrase here that it says he was blameless among his contemporaries. He wasn't blameless to God. And this word would actually mean that he didn't never sin, but that he abstained from sin. And that he was kind of above criticism from the world, but God still showed him grace. And I think what we need to see here is that even in wrath and injustice that God is about to pour out, that he's talking about here, that God still remembers mercy and grace. You see, God is going to spare Noah, and he's going to spare him and his family from this destruction. He's going to deliver Noah into a new life. And God does the same for us now, and will do that in eternity, which leads to our last point, is that there is a plan for something new. Let's check out verse 14, and we're going to read through the end of chapter 6 in this section that we're going to kind of wrap up with today. And it says this, that this is God talking to Noah. And he says, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to make it. The ark will be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Now, if you kind of do some numbers in your head, like you can go walk that off later after church if you want. That's a really, really big boat. Before power tools, before cranes. He did this all by hand. That's probably why it took him 120 years. He lived a really long time. We can answer more questions about that later. But verse 16, it says, you are to make a roof, finishing the sides of the ark to within 18 inches of the roof. You are to put a door in the side of the ark, make it with lower, middle, and upper decks. Understand that I am bringing a flood. Flood waters on the earth to destroy every creature under heaven with the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. You are to also to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of everything, from the birds according to their kinds, from the livestock according to their kinds, and from the animals that crawl on the ground according to their kinds will come to you so that you can keep them alive. Verse 21. Take with you every kind of food that is eaten. Gather it as food for you and for them. In verse 22, and Noah did this. He did everything that God had commanded him. God here communicates clearly to Noah that he has a plan to get through this broken, irredeemable world. What's crazy about this is most religions have some sort of story of a flood, of a worldwide flood. Some will call it local, some will call it worldwide, and many scientists believe that there is most likely a flood that happened on the earth that shaped topography and what we have now. But here's what's crazy is, for example, in the Babylonian time, they had a flood account. They were the kind of contemporaries of the Hebrew people here. But in their flood, their gods did it in secret away from their people. But here, we see a personal God, a loving God who doesn't do his plans in secret. He's like, I'm not just going to wipe it out, not say anything, and I'll just start fresh and create a new man, a new woman. Instead, he makes his plan known to mankind through Noah. And what we see here is that we don't have a God in secrecy, but we have a God who calls out sin, but then gives us and shows us a path to redemption. Which leads us to our final thing. This is what I kind of want us to land on and implant in us today. And the biblical truth that we get from this story is that our world has an internal problem. We are evil. We are sinful. And every inclination at times of our mind is evil, but that God has an eternal solution. You see, it's not hard to look around our world and say our world is beyond saving. There are things that happen in our world where you see it, you're like, bro, that's messed up. Like, I don't know how you get past that. And it's just like you see tragedy after tragedy. I think social media has made this so much worse because we can see what's happening all the way across the world, or we can see what's happening even in our own neighborhood so much clearer because of what is so visible to us. And there is nothing that mankind can do to save us from this destruction. We are smarter, you could say, than we've ever been. We have more technological advancements than we have ever been, but we still have just as big a problems as we ever have had. And you see, mankind will progress, we'll do things, we'll try to save ourselves, but there is something that one day our world will end. And get this, as much as you try, as great a shape as you get in, as much books as you read on self-improvement, one day you're still gonna die. Unless Jesus comes back. That's the caveat there. You always have to put it. But no matter what you do, no matter all the things you line up, one day your life in our world has an expiration date. Now, kind of the pessimist out there can be like, all right, well, does this mean we just give up? Like, we don't care about our planet because our planet's gonna die. We don't care about ourselves because we're gonna die. The answer is no. Because just like before we saw, if there's a disease in our world, we still treat the symptoms. We still push back against poverty and hunger and violence and sin that's in our world, but we ultimately don't ignore that we don't have the cure as well. And so often we can get so caught up in let me treat the symptom, that we're not looking for the cure, the solution that only God can give us, especially when it's right in front of our face. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24 gives us is what is the eternal solution of our internal sin problem that's throughout our world. It says that he, being Jesus Christ himself, bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were like sheep going astray, but you have now returned to the shepherd and overseers of your souls. You see, this internal problem, what happened in Noah's day, is it pushed them farther and farther from God. As they became more wicked, as they went more into their sinful flesh and their way, they just created this further divide to God. But here we see in what 1 Peter 2 tells us that Jesus Christ bridged that gap for us. That even though we make a mistake, even though we sin, even though we treat people like we shouldn't treat people, we fail at our jobs and our families and our neighborhoods, that Jesus died for us so that we can be restored to our heavenly Father. And it is not by our power, it is not by our solution, but it is something that he has done. And even though we have messed up, even though we have torn apart our families, we have torn apart our morals, and we have hurt our world, that Jesus came to save us from this destruction. So how do we live in response to this? I think 2 Peter chapter 3 gives us another way of what is our response when we look at a world like this, when we see it and we say, hey, our world is beyond saving. How do we respond to this? I know it's in Jesus' hands, but I can't do it myself. Well, 2 Peter 3:11 kind of tells us, here's how we view our world. And it says this, since all these things are soon to be dissolved in this way. He says, since one day the world will end, since one day you're gonna die, he said, it is clear what sort of people you should be in holy conduct, in godliness, as you wait for the day of God and you hasten its coming. Because of that day, the heavens will be dissolved with fire and the elements will melt with heat. But based on his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth where righteousness dwells. What do we do when we look around our world and it is so messed up? It is so beyond repair. And we look at our lives and it looks just as jacked up. We keep following Jesus. No matter how hard it is, no matter how depressing it gets, no matter the times when we look and we think we have the answers and we put the answers in a place and then it fails and we get depressed and we get discouraged, what do? We keep following him, knowing that it's ultimately his plan, it's his will, and it's on his timing. And this is exactly what Noah did all those years ago in Genesis chapter 6. God told him, I'm gonna wipe this whole thing out. Start building. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about how Noah responded in that. But verse 22, God gave him the plan. He told him this is gonna end badly. Everyone's gonna die. All these people that you see, all your jerky neighbors are gonna go away, okay? Here's what I want you to do. And what did verse 22 says? And Noah did this. He did everything that God commanded him to do. This morning, are we truly doing what God has commanded us to do? Are we living on our own time, by our own path, and our own strength and our own skills? Are we admitting that we don't have the power to save ourselves and to save our world, but we know the God who does? My prayer for you this morning is that you let go of it. You let God take over and you trust that he loves you, that he is in control, and he has a bigger plan for your life. Let's pray this morning.